Miss Marple and the Riddle of the Folded Maps. Chapter 1. The Garden Fête at Elmwood Green. Elmwood Green, a postcard-perfect village tucked in the gentle folds of the South Downs, was the sort of place where time politely slowed down for tea. The hedgerows were thick with dog roses and elderflower, the air faintly scented with lavender and warm bread, and the people, most of them retired, respectable, or otherwise unhurried, took great pride in knowing each other's business without ever being accused of nosiness. It was on the last Saturday of June that the annual garden fête at Elmwood Hall took place. Colonel and Mrs. Weatherby had hosted it for years, with the sort of jovial benevolence that made even the most cynical villagers feel mildly festive. There were hand-knitted bunting banners strung between the apple trees, trestle tables groaning with Victoria sponges and strawberry scones, and a modest brass band from Upper Dunsley playing green sleeves with more enthusiasm than skill. Stis, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, but currently staying with her old school friend Caroline Evesham, was sitting peacefully in the shade of a lilac bush. A cup of weak tea rested on the small table beside her. She was knitting something pale blue and lacy that looked too complex for the human eye to follow. "Do you know, Jane," said Caroline with a satisfied sigh, "there's a sort of smug wholesomeness about these gatherings. It always makes me think something terrible is bound to happen." Miss Marple gave her an indulgent smile. "People are often at their most careless when they think all is well. It's like that unfortunate business with the Moffat boy and the poisoned jam at the Women's Institute bake-off. Do you remember?" Caroline shuddered delicately. "Must you bring that up?" Before Miss Marple could reply, a voice cut through the clinking of teacups and the mild laughter of raffle winners. "Doctor! Simons, quickly! By the rockery!" The voice belonged to Iris Brentwood, the vicar's young wife, her eyes wide and face flushed. She was pointing toward the shaded path near the east end of the garden, where the rare ferns grew. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. Chairs scraped. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Colonel Weatherby dropped his biscuit. Miss Marple stood, quietly folding her knitting into her bag. Caroline clutched her arm. "What is it?" "I expect," said Miss Marple, already moving towards the commotion, "that something terrible has indeed happened." By the time she reached the rockery, the crowd had formed a nervous circle around the motionless figure of a man lying on the mossy stone. Dr. Simons was kneeling beside him, feeling for a pulse with clinical calm. The man was middle-aged, well-dressed in a brown checked jacket, his boots muddied, his cap lying askew. His hand clutched a folded piece of paper. "Dead?" asked Colonel Weatherby hoarsely. Dr. Simons straightened up, removing his spectacles. "Yes, quite dead. I'd say heart failure. Possibly sudden, though the angle of his fall suggests he may have already been disoriented." "But who is he?" Caroline whispered, looking around at the puzzled faces. Nobody spoke. A few heads shook. A murmur passed through the crowd. "I don't believe he was one of ours," murmured Mrs. Weatherby. "I didn't see him at the gate." "Nor I," said the vicar, frowning. At that moment a young constable, Frank Tibbs, newly stationed, from Dorking, arrived clearly out of breath and slightly alarmed. He attempted order. "Now please stand back. No one touch anything. I'll wire Inspector Crayford." Miss Marple, her expression politely unreadable, observed the body with quiet attention. Her gaze drifted not to the man's face, but to the object still lightly held in his hand, a crisply folded map, its edge bearing a faint smudge of red. Not blood, but ink. Later, as the constable cordoned off the area with garden string borrowed from the rose competition tent, Caroline whispered, "Well, Jane, what do you think?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes, pale and observant, remained on the paper. "I think, Caroline," she said at last, "that people rarely carry maps anymore, not unless they are looking for something. Or perhaps," she added thoughtfully, "someone." And with that, she turned back to her tea, already cooling beneath the lilac bush, her knitting forgotten, but her mind quite suddenly alive. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Elm Tree. By the following morning, Elmwood Green had done what it did best in times of uncertainty. It talked. The village shop, usually a haven for quiet gossip about marmalade brands and Mrs. Whitby's cataracts, now thrummed with speculation. Mrs. Blake, the shopkeeper, lowered her voice when she spoke, even though she very much wanted to be overheard. Collapsed he did, right there beside the ferns. Still clutching a map, they say. Ink on it, too, as if he'd drawn something. Her customer, Mr. Arnold Tetchley, nodded solemnly. "Not from around here, I heard. Stranger? Maybe a rambler." Mrs. Blake sniffed. "With polished brogues? I don't think so. Besides, the map was folded, neatly. You don't fold something if you're rushing or panicked. That's someone deliberate, that is." By mid-afternoon, 3 villagers claimed to have seen the man earlier in the week, though none could agree on his clothing or the direction he'd come from. One believed he asked about the old Brambleton Mill path. Another insisted he'd been staring at the church's weather vane for an unusually long time. And at the centre of this quiet storm sat Miss Marple in Caroline Eversham's sunroom, calmly threading a new ball of yarn through her needles. "I wonder," Caroline said, sipping her chamomile tea, "why nobody has identified him yet. You'd think someone, somewhere, would be looking for him. That," said Miss Marple softly, "is the curious thing, isn't it?" She paused, watching a robin land on the window-sill. Usually, in cases of sudden death, the family makes themselves known rather quickly. But a man who arrives quietly and dies even more quietly, with no one to claim him, well, it does give one pause. Caroline gave a little shiver. And the map, the police took it, didn't they? Yes, young Constable Tibbs collected it, though I dare say they've not made much of it yet. "Why not?" "Because," Miss Marple said mildly, "I suspect they think it a distraction, just a coincidence. People like Constable Tibbs, and even Inspector Crayford, whom I do admire in many ways, are often inclined to believe in the obvious. And of course, death at a fête must be explained away swiftly, or it upsets the rhythm of things." Caroline leaned forward. "What do you think, Jane?" Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "I think there is no such thing as coincidence in human behaviour. Not truly. Why would a man, an educated, respectable man by his clothing, walk into a fête he was not invited to alone, and die beside a rockery with a map in his hand?" Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment the doorbell rang. It was Inspector Crayford, hat in hand, his frame as angular as ever, and his expression professional but tired. "Ladies," he said with a brief nod. "Miss Marple, may I have a word?" Within minutes he was seated across from them, declining tea but accepting a biscuit, which he turned over absently in his fingers. "No identification on the man," he said bluntly. "No wallet, no driver's license, nothing. Only the map. We've sent his fingerprints up to London, but that'll take time." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You think it's simply a matter of tracing a lost traveller?" Crayford hesitated. "Well, I'd like it to be, but the map, it's not any standard issue. Ordnance survey, yes, but hand-annotated. Someone's marked a trail through Elmwood Green with red ink. But the lines are oddly angled, almost geometric. There's a little X drawn behind the churchyard." "Behind the churchyard?" repeated Caroline. "But there's nothing there. Just the old gardener's shed and a few wild gooseberry bushes." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Unless he was looking for something that used to be there, or something only he knew was there. Crayford gave her a measured look. "You've a keen nose for patterns, Miss Marple. That's why I came." "Oh, I don't think it's patterns," Miss Marple said gently. "I think it's people." Crayford smiled faintly. "Yes, well, if you hear anything useful in the village, let me know. Until then, I'll keep the press out of it." As the inspector left, Caroline exhaled heavily. "This is going to stir up every ghost story in the county." Miss Marple nodded. "And every guilty conscience, too." That evening, as twilight settled in over the rooftops and the scent of honeysuckle hung low in the air, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village lanes. She paused outside the churchyard, peering through the hedge at the back path. The moon was rising, and a faint breeze rustled the wild grass. There was nothing there, at first glance, but she noted the disturbed soil behind the gardener's shed, as if someone had recently walked there. Not a gardener. There were no tools, no recent plantings, and the gooseberry bushes were wild and unpruned. She turned slowly, noting the shape of the map in her mind's eye, and imagined the red line arcing behind the graves pointing to what? As she walked back toward Caroline's cottage, she heard the faint chime of the church bell, an unusual sound at such an hour, and with that, she knew, the mystery was no longer just about who the dead man was. It was about why he had come, here at all. Chapter 3. The Man with the Empty Locket. The following morning arrived with a clear sky and the sound of sparrows squabbling in the eaves. Miss Marple had just returned from her customary early walk when Caroline called to her from the breakfast table. "Jane, come quickly, it's in the paper." The Mid-Downs Gazette lay open, and across the bottom of page 3 was a small but prominently boxed item, "Mystery Death at Garden Fête." Man collapses during village event. Identity still unknown. Police investigation ongoing. Sources confirm. A folded map found at the scene. Caroline looked up, frowning. They say someone came forward. Miss Marple took the paper delicately, her eyes scanning the article. "It's a Mr. Alfred Pendry," Caroline continued, "from Overcombe. Claims he met the man once before. At a book auction, of all things." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Oh, did he give a name?" "No, just said the man introduced himself as Mr. John, something or other. Pendry said he remembered the face, but not the surname." "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "One would expect even a faint acquaintance to recall a surname. especially one met through something as memorable as a book auction. In Shua and Bus hour later, Constable Tibbs arrived at Caroline's gate, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Inspector Crayford says you may be interested in something we found on the deceased." He handed her a small evidence envelope. Inside was a simple brass locket, its hinge stiff from time. Miss Marple opened it gently. It was empty. "Curious," she said softly. "Very curious." Caroline peered over her shoulder. No photograph. None. No initials either. She held it to the light, and yet it was worn regularly. You can see the indentation on the chain's hook. This was once treasured. Tibbs shifted awkwardly. "Inspector says you're to have a look at it, see if anything strikes you. We've run out of ideas." Miss Marple gave him a warm smile. "Thank you, Constable. That's very thoughtful." After Tibbs departed, she sat with the locket resting on a handkerchief beside her teacup. Caroline, watching her friend's face, said, "You're thinking something." "I'm always thinking something, dear, but in this case I'm thinking of absences, of what's not there, the photograph. Yes, and what its absence suggests. A locket is usually a thing of memory, of love. To carry one empty is quite symbolic. You think he took the photograph out? Perhaps. Or someone else did." Later that day, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit Mr. Alfred Pendry in Overcombe. Caroline, having other errands, declined to join her. The Pendry residence was a neat red brick home, with symmetrical windows and a fussy boxwood hedge. Alfred Pendry was a thin man with a soft moustache and a way of blinking too often. He ushered Miss Marple into a sitting-room filled with leather-bound books and the faint smell of mothballs. Yes, dreadful thing," he said, folding his hands. "I saw it in the paper and recognized him immediately. That is to say, I recognized the face. From an auction in Worthing. Just last month, I believe." Miss Marple smiled. "Book auctions can be rather competitive, indeed. He outbid me on a rare military memoir, Letters from Crimea. Rather sharp fellow. Wore gloves, I remember that. Odd for June. Did you happen to hear what name he gave at the registration table?" "John Beale, I believe, though I may be mistaken. His penmanship was rather awful." "Beale," Miss Marple repeated. "Not a local name, I think." "Oh, no, not from around here. Northern accent, very clipped, kept to himself, but quite sure of what he wanted." Miss Marple let the silence sit for a moment, then said lightly, "You wouldn't have a catalogue from the auction, would you?" "I adore seeing what people fight over," Pendry chuckled, rising. "Of course, one moment." When he stepped out, Miss Marple's eyes flicked to a stack of books by the fireplace. Among them was a slim, battered volume titled War Medals, and their owners, a private catalogue. She took note. Pendry returned, handing her the catalogue. "There," he said, pointing. "Oh, lot 47, the memoir. May I take this with me?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, I've already marked what I wanted." Miss Marple thanked him and left soon after, but her thoughts remained tangled. A man with a false, or half-remembered, name. A military memoir. Gloves in summer. A locket without a photo. A map with a red X behind a church. Something was emerging, but not yet formed. Back in Elmwood Green, she returned the locket to Inspector Crayford with a note. "It may be Worth checking if the locket originally contained a photograph. A faded square mark suggests it did. The absence is telling. She made one more stop, at the churchyard. She asked the verger, Mr. Ludlow, about the grounds behind the shed. Used to be a small outbuilding there, he told her. Old caretaker's quarters, long gone now. Burned down in the 50s, and before that, he rubbed his chin. Well now, some sort of storage, I suppose. Records, maybe. It's all brambles now. Miss Marple nodded and took a slow walk around the back, her shoes brushing the damp grass. She paused where the soil was slightly raised. Not dug recently, but disturbed once, perhaps years ago. She gazed into the silence, then turned back toward the vicarage, her footsteps steady, her mind already turning toward the next question. Chapter 4. A Conversation with the Vicar's Wife. The vicarage of Elmwood Green was a modest but elegant dwelling tucked beside the church, with ivy climbing across the stonework and the faint scent of beeswax always lingering in the hallway. Miss Marple had been invited to tea by Iris Brentwood, the vicar's wife, under the innocent pretext of catching up on parish news. But Miss Marple suspected quite rightly that Iris, like most perceptive women, was also deeply curious. "I'm still shaken by it, you know," Iris confessed as she poured the tea. "To think he died right there, within view of the jam stall. I was just arranging a tray of Battenberg. One minute I looked up, and the next, he was on the ground." Miss Marple accepted her tea with a soft smile. "You saw him before he collapsed?" "Oh, yes. I remember because I didn't recognize him. He was standing near the fern path, just on the edge of things, not mingling, watching." "Watching whom?" Miss Marple asked gently. Iris hesitated. "That's just it. It didn't seem like he was watching anyone in particular. More waiting. That's the impression I got. As if he expected someone to come and meet him." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And did anyone approach him?" "No, not that I noticed. He might have spoken to someone earlier. Colonel Weatherby thought he might have seen him near the lemonade stand, but he wasn't sure." Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea, her mind moving steadily. "You've been here several years now, haven't you, Mrs. Brentwood?" "Oh, 4," Iris said. "We came from Little Sidley. My husband took the living here after Canon Heath retired. Do you happen to know," Miss Marple continued casually, "if there were ever any unusual happenings connected to the church grounds? Perhaps something long before your time, something that might have caused talk?" Iris blinked at her. "You mean like a scandal?" "Well," said Miss Marple delicately, "scandals do tend to cling to churches more than one might expect." Iris set her cup down and folded her hands in her lap. "I do recall something. When we first moved in, an elderly woman, Mrs. Crowthorne, I believe, said something odd to me one afternoon. We were talking about the grave markers behind the church, and she suddenly said they should never have buried her there, not with what she knew." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted faintly. "Her?" I asked who she meant, of course, but Mrs. Crowthorne just shook her head and changed the subject. I assumed she was rambling. "But you remember it clearly?" "Yes," Iris said, thoughtful, "because she spoke with such certainty. I always wondered who her was." Miss Marple turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window that looked out over the churchyard. The grass rippled faintly in the breeze, casting long shadows between the worn gravestones. That part of the churchyard, behind the shed, it's rarely visited, is it? Hardly at all. Most of the newer burials are to the west. That corner is overgrown now." Miss Marple nodded, which means if someone wished to meet there, or hide something, few would notice. There was a pause, filled only by the quiet ticking of the vicarage's mantel clock. "I believe," said Miss Marple after a moment, "that our mysterious visitor may have come not simply to meet someone, but to recover something, or to uncover it." Iris leaned in. "You think he was looking for a grave?" "Not necessarily a grave," Miss Marple murmured, "but something long hidden, linked perhaps to an old wrong. You'd be surprised how many secrets are buried near churches." As she rose to leave, Miss Marple noticed a stack of parish records on a hallway shelf. Baptisms, weddings, and deaths, all neatly labelled by year. "Have these been digitized?" she asked. Iris shook her head. "Not yet. The vicar means to, but he's hopeless with the computer." "Why?" "Oh, I've always been fascinated by old registers," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "One learns so much about a place through its patterns." With Iris's permission, she selected 2 volumes, one from 1952 and one from 1968, and carried them back to Caroline's cottage under the crook of her arm. That afternoon, while Caroline worked in the garden, Miss Marple pored over the records at the small kitchen table. The 1952 volume was unremarkable. A handful of marriages, several deaths from natural causes, a sprinkling of christenings. Then, near the back, something caught her eye. Burial. Elizabeth Rowntree, aged 33. Cause of death, misadventure. No next of kin listed. Buried, east side, near Groundshed Wall. Miss Marple stared at the name. It meant nothing to her at first, until she... Chapter 5. The archivist's warning Miss Marple had always held that the truly interesting people in any village were not the most vocal, but the quiet ones, the caretakers, the librarians, the archivists, people who dealt in paper, not opinion. And in the quiet village of Elmwood Green, no one fit that description more precisely than Mr. Lionel Greaves. He was the parish archivist, a title he wore as seriously as a judge's robe. Greaves had once worked for the British Library, so he claimed, though no one had ever verified this, and now presided over the Elmwood Historical Society with the reverence of a high priest. He lived alone in a house with dustier curtains than seemed possible, and he never once attended the garden fête. Miss Marple called on him that same afternoon, having written a small note requesting a gentle discussion on parish history. The door opened after 2 knocks, and Mr. Greaves appeared, tall, angular, and dressed in what could only be described as academic brown. "Miss Marple," he said with a slight bow. "Your letter intrigued me." She smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Greaves. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. I find myself free until supper. Please come in." The interior was as she remembered. Shelves of curling parish papers, glass-fronted cabinets of hand-labelled folders, and a grandfather clock that ticked with a kind of scholarly judgment. She was ushered into a room that smelled of parchment and dried lavender. "I'm looking into something that may be nothing at all," she began modestly, "but I've become interested in a woman buried behind the church in 1952, Elizabeth Rowntree." Mr. Greaves, already seated, looked up sharply. "Oh, that name. You remember her then?" "Only by reputation," he said, interlacing his fingers. "I was still a boy when she died. But in this village, certain stories survive longer than the gravestones." He stood and walked to a narrow filing cabinet. From a drawer marked "Deaths Unusual," he drew a slender manila folder, thick with folded correspondence and yellowed newspaper clippings. "She was found drowned," he said matter-of-fact, "in the mill pond, wearing a blue dress and carrying no identification." It was some time before they even confirmed her name. Miss Marple listened silently. "No suicide note," Greaves continued, "and no clear reason. The coroner recorded it as death by misadventure, though everyone knew that meant they simply couldn't decide." Was she known in the village? Only distantly. Married to Thomas Rowntree, who ran the stationer's shop. He was older than her by a good 15 years. Quiet man. The kind of husband one might call safe. Until he wasn't. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had she brought them, would have clicked with interest. Was there scandal? Greaves gave a mirthless chuckle. Mild. Rumours of an affair, though nothing ever proven. Elizabeth was said to be restless, prone to walking late at night, overly friendly with visitors to the pub, but nothing that would justify a tragedy. And the husband? He withdrew, sold the shop, moved to a small cottage near the woods, lived alone for years, refused to speak of her. Miss Marple sat back. "In the parish record," she said gently, "it noted that he requested to be buried away from her. That seems telling." Greaves nodded. It raised eyebrows, certainly, but Thomas had no children, no close relatives. There was no one to contest his wishes. He died in relative obscurity. She pointed to the folder. "May I?" He handed it over with reluctant reverence. Inside were brittle newspaper clippings from the Mid-Downs Chronicle. One headline read, "Mysterious Drowning. Local woman found in mill pond." Subheading, "Foul play not suspected. Husband declines to comment." Another clipping showed a grainy photograph of Elizabeth Rowntree, dark-haired, eyes wide set, with a kind of unsettled beauty. She looked not unlike the actresses of the day, but with something else, a guardedness behind the smile. Beneath the papers was a short letter, unsigned, addressed to the vicar of the time. It was dated 2 months after her burial. "There is something wrong in how she died. The water was not her choice. Ask about the locket. Ask the boy who saw her fall." Miss Marple read the note twice. "Do you know who wrote this?" she asked. Greaves shook his head. "Anonymous. It was found in the offering box one Sunday morning. The vicar, Canon Heath, kept it in the file. Said it was likely nonsense. Did the police investigate further?" "Briefly. They interviewed a few people, but no witnesses came forward. The boy mentioned in the note was never found. Canon Heath tried to trace the handwriting, I believe, but nothing came of it." Miss Marple carefully refolded the papers. "Do you mind if I borrow these?" "For a short time," Greaves said cautiously. "They are not to leave the village." "They shan't," she said with a smile. "Neither shall I." On her walk back to Caroline's cottage, the village felt subtly altered. The same hollyhocks nodded beside white picket fences. The same bicycles leaned lazily against walls, but the air seemed thicker with memory. Elizabeth Rowntree, the mysterious death, the locket, and now a visitor with a map, found dead not far from where she lay buried. When she arrived home, she found Caroline on the porch with a letter in hand. "It came just now," Caroline said, handing it over. "From Inspector Crayford." Miss Marple opened it. Inside was a brief note. "We identified the dead man. Name, Benjamin Crowther, formerly Benjamin Rowntree. Changed his name in 1974 after moving to Birmingham. He was the son of Elizabeth Rowntree, adopted out after her death. Local records confirm birth in 1948. Father listed Thomas Rowntree." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. "I thought as much," she murmured. "So he came back," Caroline said, her voice soft, "to find out what happened to his mother." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Or perhaps to prove what he already suspected. Chapter 6. The Man Who Watched from the Bell Tower. The church at Elmwood Green stood at the heart of the village like an aging sentinel, its grey stone walls worn soft by rain and centuries of whispered confessions. The bell tower, narrow and steep, was rarely visited these days, except by the verger, Mr. Ludlow, who still wound the bells by hand every Saturday afternoon in preparation for Sunday service. Miss Marple arrived at the church mid-morning, her footsteps soft on the flagstone floor. She had called ahead, and Ludlow, though mildly baffled by her interest, had agreed to meet her. He greeted her at the base of the tower, wiping his hands on a handkerchief that seemed to have done service since the coronation of Edward VII. "Miss Marple," he said with polite surprise, "haven't seen you climb these steps in years." "Nor have I," she said gently, "but I've reason to believe that someone else might have done so recently. Perhaps even on the day of the fête." Ludlow scratched the back of his head. "Well, I suppose it's possible. Doors not locked during the fête, of course, open for the public. But there's not much to see up there except dust and pigeons. And a clear view of the garden." "Ah, that's true enough." The steps up the tower were steep and winding, the air close with the scent of old wood and lichen. Ludlow led the way, wheezing slightly, until they reached the top. There, narrow slits in the stone wall looked down over the churchyard and the garden beyond. One slit faced directly onto the patch of ground behind the shed. Miss Marple approached it, steadying herself with a hand against the wall. From here, one could see the entire fête layout, the tables, the bunting, the trestle boards, and also the shaded fern path where Benjamin Crowther had collapsed. "A good place," she murmured, "for watching unnoticed." Ludlow tilted his head. "Now that you mention it, I did find a heel print up here after the fête. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured maybe a curious lad had snuck up." "Would you describe it?" "Man's boot, not muddy but firm. Heel dug in like someone had been standing still for a while." She nodded slowly. "Did you mention it to anyone?" "Didn't see the need." Miss Marple turned back to the view. "Tell me, Mr. Ludlow, do you remember Elizabeth Rowntree?" A pause. "Aye," he said at last. "That was before my time as verger, but I was a young man here then. I remember the gossip." "You don't strike me as one to traffic in gossip." He gave a modest shrug. "Even quiet folk hear things, Miss Marple, especially from the choir boys and their mothers." She waited. She was troubled, they said. Went walking at night. Some said she talked to herself. Others said she was seeing someone in secret. But that's village talk. Always someone watching the shadows too closely. Was her death believed to be suicide? By the law, perhaps, but there were whispers. About Thomas, her husband, stern man, distant. People said he didn't take kindly to her moods. And yet no charges, no inquiry. Ludlow shook his head. It was another time, and the coroner said there was no evidence of struggle. They said she wandered too close to the pond and slipped. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. And now her son returns, decades later, under another name, carrying a map that leads directly to her grave, and is found dead under mysterious circumstances. It rather stretches the bounds of coincidence. She looked back through the slit. I wonder, was he seen? Ludlow frowned. Beg pardon? Benjamin Crowther. If he did visit this tower, did someone else know he was here? Or perhaps someone followed him up or down? Ludlow looked suddenly uneasy. There was one odd thing. Oh? Saturday evening, just before sundown, I came by to tidy the tool shed. I saw someone on the tower stairs. Or at least I heard them. A creak, footsteps, but when I looked up, no one came down. Are you certain? I've worked in this church since 1969. I know it sounds. Someone was up there. Miss Marple Gavier-Dav. Chapter 7. Tea with a Widow Who Forgets Nothing. In the villages scattered across the English countryside, there are always a handful of women who serve as unofficial archivists of memory. Not historians, precisely, but something older. Curators of feeling, of moments whispered over hedgerows, of weddings and arguments and silences that stretched too long. In Elmwood Green, that person was Mrs. Ada Penrose. She lived alone in a creaking cottage at the edge of Willow Lane, in the shadow of a leaning oak tree that seemed to have grown wiser with her. Widowed some 30 years past, she had once worked as a schoolmistress, and though her knees no longer let her walk far, her mind was a ledger of decades. She missed nothing, forgot nothing, and above all, judged everything in silence. Miss Marple, who respected such qualities, called on her that Thursday afternoon, bearing a jar of Mrs. Weatherby's plum preserves. "Ada, my dear," she said gently after settling in the neat parlour, "I've come with a favour to ask, and I suspect only you might remember." Mrs. Penrose, already pouring tea with a steady hand, arched a brow. "That's dangerous talk, Jane. When people say I'm the only one who remembers, it usually means they don't like what I'll recall." Miss Marple smiled. "That's why I brought plum preserves." They shared tea in companionable quiet for several minutes. Then Miss Marple eased the conversation toward its true purpose. "Do you remember Elizabeth Rowntree?" Penrose gave no dramatic start, no gasp, only the quiet setting of her teacup onto its saucer with deliberate care. "Of course I do. She was in my choir class once, years before she married Thomas. Sang soprano. Very fine ear, very poor judgment in men. Was there talk of unhappiness in her marriage?" "There was no need for talk," Penrose said bluntly. "One could see it plain as a smudge on a window pane. She shrank after marrying him. Some women blossom with love, others wilt. Elizabeth wilted." Miss Marple let the silence grow. Penrose continued. "He wasn't cruel in the way that leaves bruises. No, Thomas Rowntree was cold as a crypt. He'd belittle her in public, correct her speech, mock her choices. It was death by inches. Did she have any support? Only Mary Chilton, her closest friend. They'd grown up together. But after Elizabeth married Thomas, even Mary drifted away. Elizabeth became isolated. Miss Marple noted the name. And after her death, Penrose exhaled. That was the strangest part. For a few weeks before she died, people said she seemed different, lighter, hopeful, as if she was planning something. And then, suddenly, she drowned. You don't believe it was an accident? I don't know what I believe, Penrose said slowly, but I do know she came to visit me the day before, sat in that very chair, brought me violets from her garden. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her bag. What did she say? She said she had made a decision, that things were about to change. She didn't say what, but she looked me in the eye, and I swear, Jane, there was steel in her. She wasn't going to be passive anymore. Miss Marple folded her hands, and then she died. Then she died, Penrose echoed, and suddenly no one remembered her bravery, only her troubles, her restlessness, that locket she wore. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. A brass one? Yes, it had a photograph in it, a baby. She said it was her son. I remember it clearly because she told me she was going to leave the village and take the boy with her. A pause, but she never did. No, said Miss Marple. She didn't. Penrose leaned forward. I always wondered if she gave that child up because she was forced or frightened. Miss Marple met her gaze. You may be right on both counts. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple asked, softly, Do you know where Mary Chilton might be now? She never left, Penrose said. She lives in a cottage near the old railway line, changed her surname years ago, married a man named Gray, but she's still Mary. Quiet, keeps to herself, but if anyone knew Elizabeth's mind, it was her. Miss Marple thanked Ada warmly and made her way down Willow Lane, the conversation pressing on her mind like a fingertip to damp paper. She now understood that Elizabeth Rowntree had not drowned by accident, at least not in spirit. She had intended to change her life, perhaps to flee, to reclaim her son, and someone had stopped her. Back at Caroline's, Miss Marple sat in the parlour with her notebook, reviewing what she now knew. Elizabeth had been preparing to leave. She had a photograph of her son in the locket. Benjamin Crowther came decades later, following a map. The locket was found on him, but empty. Someone had removed that photo. That night, as the village settled into stillness, Miss Marple returned to the churchyard once more. She stood near the grave of Elizabeth Rowntree, beneath the pale light of a waning moon. Behind her, a fox barked in the hedgerow. Somewhere, a window creaked open, and under her feet the disturbed earth whispered an old truth. Elizabeth had not gone quietly. She had resisted, and resistance, in quiet places like Elmwood Green, is remembered by few, but feared by the guilty. Chapter 8. The Woman Who Changed Her Name. The old railway cottages stood in a quiet cluster just beyond the edge of Elmwood Green, where the tracks had once run toward Eastleigh before the beaching cuts erased them. Ivy curled through the crumbling stones of the former station house, and only the rusting skeleton of the old signal post remained as a reminder that trains had ever passed this way. Miss Marple approached the last cottage in the row, a modest, slate-roofed house with a small, well-tended garden filled with lavender and sweet alyssum. A tabby cat watched her from a sunny perch on the window-sill. She knocked gently. After a pause, the door opened to reveal a woman of about 70, with iron-grey hair pinned in a low bun, and an expression that flickered between curiosity and awe. "Caution, yes. Good morning," said Miss Marple with a kindly smile. "You don't know me, but my name is Jane Marple. I believe you are, or were, Mary Chilton." The woman hesitated. "I go by Mary Grey now." "Of course. I wonder if I might have a word with you. It concerns someone you knew long ago, Elizabeth Rowntree." There was a long pause. The tabby cat jumped down and brushed past Mary's feet. "I haven't spoken about Elizabeth in years." "Which is precisely why I hoped you might," Miss Marple said gently. "I believe her story was never properly told, and someone now has paid for that silence with their life." Mary studied her with a gaze that had lost none of its sharpness with age. Then she stepped aside and held the door open. The sitting room was simple and warm, filled with the scent of fresh tea and books. On the mantelpiece sat a single photograph in a pewter frame. A much younger Mary in her wedding gown, beside a tall man with a craggy smile. "You said someone died?" Mary asked, as she poured tea with steady hands. "A man named Benjamin Crowther. But he was born Benjamin Rowntree, Elizabeth's son." Mary froze, the teapot trembling in her grip. Her son? But she gave him up. She never even held him after she planned to leave, Miss Marple said quietly, to take the child with her. Mary sat down heavily. "Yes, she did, but it all went wrong. I think you were the only person she told." Mary stared into her cup. She was frightened, Jane, not of violence, but of invisibility. Thomas never struck her, but he stripped her down, bit by bit. Her confidence, her sense of self. And when she became pregnant, he insisted it was unwise to have the child, claimed it wasn't his, said it would shame them both. She gave birth in secret? Yes, at a nursing home in Southampton. I arranged it. I was the only one who knew. She returned to the village 2 weeks later and said nothing to anyone, not even her husband. But she had the child's photo in that locket. She wore it every day. Miss Marple nodded. She visited you the day before her death. Mary's eyes welled with tears. She said she was going to leave, take the baby and start over. I begged her to wait, to plan better. She was impulsive, too trusting. I didn't know. I didn't think She died that very night, Miss Marple finished softly. Mary buried her face in her hands. I've lived with that guilt for years. Why didn't you speak up? Who would have listened? She was troubled, they said, depressed. They'd have buried the truth with her, just like they did. There was a long silence. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew the folded note from the archive. The anonymous letter to the vicar, written shortly after Elizabeth's death. Mary's eyes widened. You wrote this, didn't you? Mary nodded, slowly. I hoped the vicar would look deeper, but Canon Heath was a good man of the cloth, not a man of confrontation. He buried the letter with the rest. Miss Marple placed the note back into her bag. Benjamin came back with a map. It led to the grave behind the church. I think he wanted answers, and I think someone feared he was getting too close. Mary's expression shifted from sorrow to resolve. There's something else you need to know. She crossed to a small wooden box on the sideboard and retrieved a thin envelope, yellowed at the edges. I found this the day after Elizabeth's funeral. It had been slipped under my door. No name, no address, just this. She handed the envelope to Miss Marple, who drew out a single sheet of writing paper. The note was short. She was going to speak. It would have destroyed everything. I only meant to frighten her. But she fell. The handwriting was shaky, deliberate, like someone straining for control. Miss Marple read it twice. You kept this all these years? Mary nodded. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stir it all again. And then time passed, and no one came asking, until now. Miss Marple stood, carefully folding the note. I believe, Mary, that someone in this village has... Chapter 9. A Glove in the Garden Shed. It was the first chill morning in weeks, and a fine mist had crept over Elmwood Green like a cautious intruder. The hedges dripped with dew, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible wool coat, walked briskly toward the church, her thoughts sharper than the crisp air. The garden shed behind the church, forgotten by most, ivy strangled and half sunken into the slope, had always seemed an afterthought. But to Miss Marple it was something else entirely. A blind spot, and blind spots in her experience were where secrets liked to hide. She arrived shortly after 8, just as the sun began to melt the mist. A few birds fluttered away as she approached the shed door, which hung slightly ajar. She glanced around. The churchyard was still. Not even Mr. Ludlow, the verger, had arrived yet. She slipped inside. The shed was dim, cluttered with broken tools, rotting wood and the stale scent of mildew. A rusted lawn roller slumped in one corner, and a cracked porcelain watering jug rested on a crooked shelf. She moved carefully, her shoes crunching faintly over gravel and old pine needles. And then she saw it, half hidden behind a sack of coal dust and garden lime. A single leather glove. It was brown, supple, almost new, out of place among the dereliction. Miss Marple retrieved it delicately, holding it with a corner of her handkerchief. Men's size. No markings, no initials. But along the inner edge of the wrist she saw something peculiar. A pale smudge. She sniffed it carefully, faintly bitter, like crushed leaves. She knew the smell, foxglove. She tucked the glove carefully into her handbag and left the shed. On her way out, she met Mr. Ludlow, arriving with his keys jangling on his hip. "Bit early for a visit, Miss Marple," he said, raising his cap. "I've always believed churches hold their best truths before breakfast," she replied sweetly. "Tell me, Mr. Ludlow, has anyone used the shed recently?" He frowned. "Not to my knowledge. I store the spare hymnboards and weed killer in there, but no one's asked for them in weeks. Would you happen to know who has a key besides you?" "The vicar, of course, and perhaps the church warden. That's Mr. Carter these days. Retired, banker, took over last year." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, I know Mr. Carter, kindly man. Wears polished brogues." Ludlow blinked. Yes. Always rather sharp for a country post, if you ask me. Has he served in the village long? Only a couple of years. Moved down from Guildford, I believe. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind turning like a well-oiled clock. Back at Caroline's cottage, she laid the glove beside the note Mary Chilton had given her, 2 objects from different times, both speaking of guilt. Caroline entered the room with a pot of tea and a brow furrowed in concern. You look like someone's just solved half a riddle and doesn't know if she likes the answer. I may have, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, Caroline, what do you know of Mr. Carter, our dear churchwarden? Caroline shrugged. Not much. Pleasant enough. Always punctual at meetings. I think he lives with a niece. Keeps to himself. And before Elmwood? Guildford, I believe, though there were whispers he'd once worked in London banking. Some scandal, but nothing proven. Why? Miss Marple folded her hands. I believe he was once known by another name. Perhaps not to everyone, but certainly to at least one person. Elizabeth Rowntree. Caroline froze. You don't mean... I believe Mr. Carter is not Mr. Carter at all, Miss Marple said calmly. I believe he is James Alton, Elizabeth's cousin. She once mentioned him to Mary Chilton. A clever, ambitious young man who vanished just after Elizabeth's death. The timing is inconveniently precise. Caroline sat slowly. But why would he kill Benjamin? Because Benjamin threatened to unearth what James buried, both literally and figuratively. She opened her notebook and pointed to her careful summary of events. Elizabeth Rowntree planned to leave her husband. She told Mary and possibly James, her cousin. She had proof of her child's identity, likely kept in her locket. Someone intercepted her plans, tried to stop her. She ended up dead in the mill pond. Benjamin returned decades later under a new name. And someone, perhaps James, recognized him and poisoned him. Caroline exhaled. You think James Alton became Mr. Carter to stay hidden? Yes. And I believe he's kept himself close to the church, not for faith, but for oversight. He knew Elizabeth's grave was here, knew her son might one day come looking. And when Benjamin appeared with that folded map and questions, well, old fear resurfaced. Later that day, Miss Marple sent a discreet note to Inspector Crayford, asking him to check Guildford public records for a man named James Alton, especially one with a connection to Thomas Rowntree or his late wife. By dusk, she had her answer. Crayford arrived in person, his expression grim. You were right, he said without preamble. James Alton disappeared in 1952. He was questioned about Elizabeth Rowntree's death, but never charged, left for London, changed his name to Carter in 1960. Paper trail is sparse, but it's him. And the foxglove. Traces found on the inside of the glove. Same strain as the digitalis in Crowther's system. Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. Then I believe it's time we invited Mr. Carter to tea. Chapter 10. The widow's trap. The drawing-room of Caroline Eversham's cottage had never seen so many poised teacups and so little actual sipping. Inspector Crayford stood by the fireplace, arms folded. Miss Marple sat with her hands loosely resting on her knitting bag, her eyes on the door. And in the chair opposite her, upright and polished as ever, sat Mr. Carter, formerly James Alton, his mouth a thin, carefully controlled line. He had arrived in response to a perfectly courteous invitation from Miss Marple, under the impression that a small matter regarding church records needed his attention. His eyes had flicked once toward Crayford when he entered, and that was all. "I do hope you don't mind us being direct, Mr. Carter," Miss Marple began with a warm smile, "but it seems a rather old matter has stirred itself again, one that touches on a woman you once knew, Elizabeth Rowntree." His fingers flexed slightly against the arm of the chair. "I'm not sure I follow." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, Elizabeth had a secret. A child, born out of sight. You knew, didn't you?" Carter's jaw twitched. "Even if I had, it would have been none of my business." "Except it was," Crayford cut in, "because she confided in you, planned to leave, to take the child with her. You were afraid she would expose things." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. Not only expose her child's birth, but what Thomas Rowntree had done. How he had driven her to despair, and perhaps more. You were family, James, but you'd already begun inventing a different future for yourself, one that didn't involve scandal or ruin. His gaze flicked to her now, cold and calculating. "You've no proof?" "No? Then allow me." She opened her handbag and removed 3 items. First, the brown leather glove, found in the church garden shed, laced with foxglove residue, the same poison used to kill Benjamin Crowther. Next, the unsigned letter slipped under Mary Chilton's door after Elizabeth's death. You wrote this in 1952, anonymously. A poor attempt at confession, but telling all the same. Finally, the folded map. She smoothed it on the table. This led Benjamin, Elizabeth's son, to the churchyard. He marked the location of her grave. He was tracing her last steps, trying to find the truth. But someone followed him, watched from the bell tower, and when he got too close, she left the sentence unfinished. Carter's composure held for only a beat longer. Then it cracked. "You have no idea what she was like," he hissed. "She was going to destroy everything. She couldn't just keep quiet. She was reckless, selfish." "She was frightened," Miss Marple said, with sudden steel in her voice. "But she was trying to reclaim her life. That does not make her dangerous. It makes her brave." Crayford stepped forward. "You've hidden for 50 years, but it ends now." Carter said nothing as Crayford took him gently by the arm and led him from the room. When the door shut, Caroline released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He killed her, didn't he?" Miss Marple's eyes remained on the map. "Yes, I believe he followed her to the pond that night. Likely intended to frighten her, perhaps even persuade her to stay silent. But Elizabeth was stronger than he expected. Perhaps there was a struggle, or perhaps he pushed harder than he meant to. And then, all these years later—" "Benjamin returned," Miss Marple said softly, "looking for answers. And James, now calling himself Carter, panicked. He used foxglove because it mimicked natural heart failure, but poison, like guilt, leaves traces." Caroline sat beside her. "You always said the truth will out in time." Miss Marple folded the locket, now restored with Benjamin's photograph of his mother tucked back inside, and set it gently beside the map. "It often does," she said, "especially when love persists longer than fear." Epilogue, the funeral for Benjamin Crowther was held a week later, under a soft grey sky that promised drizzle, but never quite delivered. Miss Marple stood near the back, hat in hand, her face solemn. A simple headstone was placed beside Elizabeth Rowntree's grave. Last mother and son reunited. The village had turned out in respectful silence, some remembering the fête, some pretending not to remember at all. Afterward, Miss Marple returned to the cottage, poured herself a modest sherry, and sat with her knitting. The pattern was complex, delicate, but in her hands every thread found its place, just like the truth. Epilogue. The village of Elmwood Green returned, slowly and quietly, to its familiar Ritty.